you to Mr. Steve Keats. They're still on echo. Oh, he's with the Friends of the Ernie Pyle, and he operates Ernie Pyle World War II Museum.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming, and those who are on Zoom. I hope the ones on Zoom aren't getting the echo there. 80 years ago, Ernie Pyle was on a transport ship near Okinawa. The invasion had started April 1st. He'd spent a few days there. Everyone was relieved because unexpectedly, the Japanese did not fight him at the beaches. And he felt like he had gotten his final reprieve. When he went to the Pacific, he had premonition. He didn't think he would come back. And he wrote and told his dear friend, he said, okay, no more landings. I've done all of them I'm going to do. But he was convinced to go to a little 10-square island called Ishima that was near Okinawa, that had some airfields, and they were going to invade it. So he waited until after the invasion before he landed on the island. And then on the 18th of April, he was killed by a Japanese machine gun fire. So we think it's kind of the timing of having this is excellent because of the anniversary coming up. And we'd like to go ahead and start the show. And then afterwards, we can talk a little bit about the museum, and maybe I can answer any questions you might have. So without further ado, we'll see how it goes. To understand the role Ernie Pyle played in World War II, you have to read or hear his words. What do you see and feel when you listen to his following dispatch? Now to the infantry, the goddamned infantry, as they like to call themselves. I love the infantry because they are the underdogs. They are the mud, rain, frost, and wind boys. They have no comforts, and they even learn to live without the necessities. And in the end, they are the guys that wars can't be won without. I wish you could see just one of the ineradicable pictures I have in my mind today. In this particular picture, I am sitting among clumps of swordgrass on a steep and rocky hillside that we have just taken. We are looking out over a vast rolling country to the rear. A narrow path comes like a ribbon over a hill miles away, down a long slope, across a creek, up a slope, and over another hill. All along the length of this ribbon there is now a thin line of men. For 4 days and nights they have fought hard, eaten little, washed none, and slept hardly at all. Their nights have been violent with attack, fright, butchery, and their days sleepless and miserable with the crash of artillery. The men are walking. They are 50 feet apart for dispersal. Their walk is slow, for they are dead weary, as you can tell even when looking at them from behind. Every line and sag of their bodies speaks their inhuman exhaustion. On their shoulders and backs they carry heavy steel tripods, machine gun barrels, leaden boxes of ammunition. Their feet seem to sink into the ground from the overload they are bearing. They don't slouch. It is the terrible deliberation of each step that spells out their appalling tiredness. Their faces are black and unshaven. They are young men, but the grime and whiskers and exhaustion make them look middle-aged. In their eyes as they pass is not hatred, not excitement, not despair, not the tonic of their victory. There is just the simple expression of being here, as though they had been here doing this forever and nothing else. The line moves on, but it never ends. All afternoon, men keep coming around the hill and vanishing eventually over the horizon. It is one long, tired line of ant-like men. There is an agony in your heart, and you almost feel ashamed to look at them. They are just guys from Broadway and Main Street, but you wouldn't remember them. They are too far away now. They are too tired. Their world can never be known to you, but if you could see them just once, just for an instant, you would know that no matter how hard people work back home, they are not keeping pace with these infantrymen in Tunisia. If you close your eyes, can you visualize the line of exhausted, weighted-down infantrymen kicking up the North African dust as they trudge by Ernie's vantage point? Ernest Taylor Pyle was born August 3, 1900, on the Sam Elder farm about a mile south of Dana, Indiana, to Maria, her maiden name was Taylor, and William Clyde Pyle, who was a tenant farmer. The birthplace was saved from demolition by the Friends of Ernie Pyle and moved to its present site on the south edge of Dana and is part of the Ernie Pyle World War II Museum. Dana is a small town in west central Indiana, about a mile east of the Illinois border. Stories about Pyle's family would be sprinkled throughout his columns over the years. Although he loved his family, farming was never what he longed to do. His well-known column about the prairie wind hints at his feelings about farming and the toil it exacts on those who till the soil. It was soon after crossing into Iowa, coming south, that I gradually became conscious of the wind. I don't know whether you know that long, sad wind that blows so steadily across thousands of miles of Midwest flatlands in the summertime. If you don't, it will be hard for you to understand the feeling I have about it. Even if you do know it, you may not understand, because maybe the wind is only a symbol. But to me, the summer wind in the Midwest is one of the most melancholy things in all life. It comes from so far and it blows so gently and yet so relentlessly. It rustles the leaves and the branches of the maple trees in a sort of symphony of sadness. And it doesn't pass on and leave them still. No, it just keeps coming, like the infinite flow of Old Man River. You could, and you do, wear out your lifetime on the dusty plains with that wind of futility blowing in your face. And when you are worn out and gone, the wind, still saying nothing, still so gentle and sad and timeless, is still blowing across the prairies, and will blow in the faces of the little men that follow you forever. That is it, the endlessness of it. It is a symbol of eternity. After graduation from Bono High School, Ernie enlisted in the Naval Reserve, but World War I ended before his training was finished. He then enrolled at Indiana University in 1919 and began his journalistic career as a sophomore with the student-written Indiana Daily Student. His wanderlust also became evident in 1922, as Pyle and three fraternity brothers left school for a semester to follow the IU baseball team on a trip to Japan. The quartet found work aboard the SS Keystone State as the steamer crossed the Pacific, making stops in Shanghai, Hong Kong, and Manila in addition to Japan. Pyle returned to IU and was named editor-in-chief of the student newspaper for his senior year. He also was selected to be a senior manager of IU's football team in the fall of 1922. The desk he used at the school newspaper is still there in the Indiana Daily Student offices in Franklin Hall, where a statue of Ernie Pyle sits outside the entrance of the building, where journalism students still learn how to communicate to readers and viewers the best version of the truth available. Pyle left IU a semester short of graduation in January of 1923 to take a reporting job with the Daily Herald in LaPorte, Indiana, earning $25 a week. 3 months later, he moved to Washington, D.C. to join the staff of the newly created Scripps Howard newspaper, the Washington Daily News, where he soon became a copy editor. His pay increased to $30 a week. In Washington, he met Minnesota native Geraldine Siebels, or Jerry, at a Halloween party. Their relationship was a troubled one. They both abused alcohol. He dealt with bouts of depression, and she suffered from what now doctors believe was a bipolar disorder. She attempted suicide more than once. They had no children. His wanderlust struck again in 1926. Ernie and Jerry quit their jobs and spent 10 weeks traveling 9,000 miles across the United States in a Ford Model T Roadster. After brief stints with the Evening World and New York Post in New York City, Pyle returned to the Daily News in December of 1927 to become one of the first and best-known reporters on the emerging aviation industry. His aviation column was syndicated for Scripps Howard newspapers from 1928 to 1932. Never a pilot, but Ernie flew about 100,000 miles. His unpretentious but descriptive writing style emerges as he tells tales of fearless pilots of the Postal Service and other aviation pioneers. When asked once if she knew Ernie Pyle, Amelia Earhart responded, "Any aviator who didn't know Ernie Pyle was a nobody." A grateful aviation community presented Ernie with a watch when he left the aviation industry beat. He was wearing that watch when he died. In 1932, Pyle was named managing editor at the Daily News, but his passion was always writing, not editing or managing a staff. In December of 1934, Pyle took an extended vacation in the western United States to recuperate from a severe bout of influenza. When he returned, he wrote a series of 11 columns about his trip and the people he met to fill in for the paper's vacationing syndicated columnist, Hayward Broun. The columns were so popular with readers and editors that Pyle left his position in 1935 as managing editor to write his own national column as a roving Hoosier vagabond to write human interest columns for the Scripps Howard's newspaper chain. Remember that this was during the Great Depression. From 1935 to 1942, Ernie and Jerry, who he referred to as "that girl who rides with me" in his stories, traveled across the United States, Canada, Mexico, and both Central and South America. He wrote 6 columns a week and built a national following. During their travels, the Pyles purchased property in 1940 about 3 miles from downtown Albuquerque, New Mexico, and built a 1,145 square foot home. That home now serves as a public library. When war broke out in Europe, Pyle volunteered to go to London to cover the Battle of Britain. He wrote this memorable column in December of 1940 of the bombing of Great Britain's capital. "Someday, when peace has returned to this odd world, I want to come to London again and stand on a certain balcony on a moonlit night and look down upon the peaceful silver curve of the Thames with its dark bridges. And standing there, I want to tell somebody who has never seen it how London looked on a certain night in the holiday season of the year 1940. For on that night, this old city, even though I must bite my tongue in shame for saying it, was the most beautiful sight I had ever seen. It was a night when London was ringed and stabbed with fire. They came just after dark, and somehow I could sense from the quick, bitter firing of the guns that there was to be no monkey business this night. Shortly after the sirens wailed, I could hear the Germans grinding overhead. In my room, with its black curtains drawn across the windows, you could feel the shake from the guns. You could hear the boom, crump, crump, crump of heavy bombs at their work of tearing buildings apart. They were not too far away. Half an hour after the firing started, I gathered a couple of friends and went to a high, darkened balcony that gave us a view of 1/3 of the entire circle of London. As we stepped out onto the balcony, a vast inner excitement came over all of us, an excitement that had neither fear nor horror in it because it was too full of awe. You have all seen big fires, but I doubt if you have ever seen the whole horizon of a city lined with great fires, scores of them, perhaps hundreds. The closest fires were near enough for us to hear the crackling flames and the yells of firemen. Little fires grew into big ones even as we watched. Big ones died down under the firemen's valor only to break out again later. About every 2 minutes a new wave of planes would be over. The motors seemed to grind rather than roar, and to have an angry pulsation, like a bee buzzing in blind fury. The bombs did not make a constant, overwhelming din as in those terrible days of last September. They were intermittent, sometimes a few seconds apart, sometimes a minute or more. Their sound was sharp when nearby and soft and muffled far away. Into the dark, shadowed spaces below us, as we watched, whole batches of incendiary bombs fell. We saw 24 go off in 2 seconds. They flashed terrifically, then quickly simmered down to pinpoints of dazzling white, burning ferociously. These white pinpoints would go out one by one as the unseen heroes of the moment smothered them with sand. But also, as we watched, other pinpoints would burn on, and pretty soon a yellow flame would leap up from the white center. They had done their work. Another building was on fire. The greatest of all the fires was directly in front of us. Flames seemed to whip hundreds of feet into the air. Pinkish white smoke ballooned upward in a great cloud, and out of this cloud there gradually took shape, so faintly at first that we weren't sure we saw correctly, the gigantic dome and spires of St. Paul's Cathedral. St. Paul's was surrounded by fire, but it came through. It stood there in its enormous proportions, growing slowly clearer and clearer, the way objects take shape at dawn. It was like a picture of some miraculous figure that appears before peace-hungry soldiers on a battlefield. The streets below us were semi-illuminated from the glow. Immediately above the fires, the sky was red and angry, and overhead, making a ceiling in the vast heavens, there was a cloud of smoke all in pink. Up in that pink shrouding there were tiny brilliant specks of flashing light, anti-aircraft shells bursting. After the flash, you could hear the sound. Up there, too, the barrage balloons were standing out as clearly as if it were daytime, but now they were pink instead of silver, and now and then, through a hole in that pink shroud, there twinkled incongruously a permanent, genuine star, the old-fashioned kind that has always been there. Below us, the Thames grew lighter, and all around below were the shadows, the dark shadows of buildings and bridges that formed the base of this dreadful masterpiece. Later on, I borrowed a tin hat and went out among the fires. That was exciting too, but the thing I shall always remember above all the other things in my life is the monstrous loveliness of that one single view of London on a holiday night. London stabbed with great fires, shaken by explosions, its dark regions along the Thames sparkling with the pinpoints of white-hot bombs, all of it roofed over with a ceiling of pink that held bursting shells, balloons, flares, and the grind of vicious engines. And in yourself the excitement and anticipation and wonder in your soul that this could be happening at all. These things all went together to make the most hateful, most beautiful single scene I have ever known. It was a year later that the United States entered World War II with the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese Navy. Prior to that event, Pyle had returned to the U.S. in March of 1941 and took a 3-month leave of absence to care for Jerry. Jerry did not improve, and they were divorced in April of 1942. Pyle accepted the assignment to become a war correspondent for Scripps Howard newspapers and returned to Great Britain in June of that year. But Ernie and Jerry's tortured relationship continued, with them becoming remarried by proxy in March of 1943 while he was in North Africa. There were several hundred American war correspondents, but none was more popular than the skinny, balding reporter embedded with the infantry as they invaded North Africa, then Sicily, and then Italy. He was determined to give readers back home the worm's eye view of the war. While he knew the generals, Eisenhower, Bradley, Patton, he didn't spend his time at headquarters writing about strategy and tactics, as he did when covering the aviation industry or America in the Depression. His stories were about individuals. He didn't sugarcoat the war or glorify it. He described the tribulations of ordinary Americans plucked from the States and dropped into the war to fight the professional armies of Germany, Italy, and Japan. The GIs were there to do a necessary job and do it as quickly as possible so they could return home. The United States has not been impacted as intently by any conflict since World War II as they were then. Commodities were rationed. Blackouts were imposed along coastlines. Women were thrust into industrial production. Victory gardens and recycling drives became commonplace. Families were displaced as military installations were built from scratch across the country. The secret Wabash Ordnance Works constructed north of Dana displaced so many families that today's population is only one-third what it was pre-war. This facility created the heavy water that was shipped to Oak Ridge, Tennessee as part of the Manhattan Project to build the atomic bomb. From 1943 to 1945, every male graduate of Dana High School, except for 2 with health issues, went directly from high school into the armed services. There were 323 veterans of World War II from Dana and the immediate rural area. Dana's population today is only 555. Americans wanted to know what their husbands, sons, and other family members were enduring halfway around the world, and that was what Ernie focused on. He would spend a week or 2 on the front line interviewing soldiers, and then getting back to a headquarters where he would crank out 1 or 2 weeks of columns and dispatch them back to the United States. Here's one of the 3 columns he wrote immediately after the D-Day invasion of Normandy, France, in June of 1944. I took a walk along the historic coast of Normandy in the country of France. It was a lovely day for strolling along the seashore. Men were sleeping on the sand, some of them sleeping forever. Men were floating in the water, but they didn't know they were in the water, for they were dead. The water was full of squishy little jellyfish about the size of your hand, millions of them. In the center, each of them had a green design exactly like a 4-leaf clover. The good luck emblem. Sure, hell yes. I walked for 1.5 miles along the water's edge of our many-miled invasion beach. You wanted to walk slowly, for the detail on that beach was infinite. The wreckage was vast and startling. The awful waste and destruction of war, even aside from the loss of human life, has always been one of its outstanding features to those who are in it. Anything and everything is expendable, and we did expend on our beachhead in Normandy during those first few hours. For 1 mile out from the beach, there were scores of tanks and trucks and boats that you could no longer see, for they were at the bottom of the water, swamped by overloading or hit by shells or sunk by mines. Most of their crews were lost. You could see trucks tipped half over and swamped. You could see partly sunken barges and the angled up corners of jeeps and small landing craft half submerged. And at low tide, you could still see those vicious 6-pronged iron snares that helped snag and wreck them. On the beach itself, high and dry, were all kinds of wrecked vehicles. There were tanks that had only just made the beach before being knocked out. There were jeeps that had been burned to a dull gray. There were big derricks on caterpillar treads that didn't quite make it. There were half-tracks carrying office equipment that had been made into a shambles by a single shell hit, their interiors still holding their useless equipage of smashed typewriters, telephones, office files. There were LCTs turned completely upside down and lying on their backs, and how they got that way I don't know. There were boats stacked on top of each other, their sides caved in, their suspension doors knocked off. In this shoreline museum of carnage, there were abandoned rolls of barbed wire and smashed bulldozers and big stacks of thrown away lifebelts and piles of shells still waiting to be moved. In the water floated empty life rafts and soldiers' packs and ration boxes and mysterious oranges. On the beach lay snarled rolls of telephone wire and big rolls of steel matting and stacks of broken, rusting rifles. On the beach lay expended, sufficient men and mechanism for a small war. They were gone forever now, and yet we could afford it. We could afford it because we were on. We had our toehold. and behind us there were such enormous replacements for this wreckage on the beach that you could hardly conceive of their sum total. Men and equipment were flowing from England in such a gigantic stream that it made the waste on the beachhead seem like nothing at all, really nothing at all. A few hundred yards back on the beach is a high bluff. Up there we had a tent hospital and a barbed wire enclosure for prisoners of war. From up there you could see far up and down the beach in a spectacular crow's nest view and far out to sea. And standing out there on the water beyond all this wreckage was the greatest armada man has ever seen. You simply could not believe the gigantic collection of ships that lay out there waiting to unload. Looking from the bluff, it lay thick and clear to the far horizon of the sea and beyond, and it spread out to the sides and was miles wide. Its utter enormity would move the hardest man. As I stood up there, I noticed a group of freshly taken German prisoners standing nearby. They had not yet been put in the prison cage. They were just standing there, a couple of doughboys leisurely guarding them with Tommy guns. The prisoners, too, were looking out to sea, the same bit of sea that for months and years had been so safely empty before their gaze. Now they stood staring, almost as if in a trance. They didn't say a word to each other. They didn't need to. The expression on their faces was something forever unforgettable, and it was the final, horrified acceptance of their doom. If only all Germans could have had the rich experience of standing on the bluff and looking out across the water and seeing what their compatriots saw. Ernie wasn't immune from the trauma of combat. In fact, his sensitive soul may have made him more susceptible to what we now call post-traumatic stress. Listen to Pyle's letter to his friend Lee Miller, who he met on the Daily News staff when he first moved to Washington, D.C. Dear Lee, Stars and Stripes this morning carried a 2-column piece about Ray Clapper being killed. I'm just floored by it. Somehow it never occurred to me that anything would ever happen to him. What a waste of intelligence and character, as the whole war is. It gives me the creeps. The whole thing is getting pretty badly under my skin, Lee. I've got so I brood about it, about the whole thing. I mean, and I have a personal reluctance to die that is always in my mind, like a weight. Instead of growing stronger and hard as good veterans do, I've become weaker and more frightened. I'm all right when I'm actually at the front, but it's when I pull back and start thinking and visualizing that it almost overwhelms me. I've even got so I don't sleep well and have half-awake, hideous dreams about the war. I've really been sick with this cold, but I think I might have kept the columns going anyhow, except I was just so low in spirit. I didn't have the will to struggle against them when my deadline was so close, and I felt so lousy. I'm writing again now, with much difficulty, and will start sending them again in a day or two. I've almost reached the point where I've had it, as soldiers and flyers say when they can't take it any longer. I'd quit and come home for good, except I don't suppose I could live with myself if I did, and would gradually go nuts. If I can just see the European war out, I think I might feel justified in quitting the war. It was only by a miracle that some correspondents on the beachhead landing weren't killed. He ended the letter with, "Guess that's all there is just now. Probably I'll be feeling more chipper in a few days." His prowls on the front lines in Europe brought him close to death on more than one occasion. He stepped out onto a balcony in Anzio, Italy, for a smoke one morning, and his bedroom was covered with debris when a German artillery shell hit the building during his cigarette break. At the front in July of 1944 to cover Operation Cobra, the breakout from the hedgerow country of Normandy, he was observing the use of B-17 flying fortresses for the first and only time being used to tactically blast a hole in the German lines. There were so many B-17s involved that it took nearly 3 hours for them to pass overhead. Unfortunately, a breeze pushed the smoke line that marked where the bombardiers were to unleash their deadly load back over the American position. Here's Pyle's description of what happened. It is possible to become so enthralled by some of the spectacles of war that you are momentarily captivated away from your own danger. That's what happened to our little group of soldiers as we stood in a French farmyard, watching the mighty bombing of the German lines just before our breakthrough. But the benign state didn't last long. As we watched, there crept into our consciousness a realization that windows of exploding bombs were easing back towards us, flight by flight, instead of gradually forward as the plan called for. Then we were horrified by the suspicion that those machines, high in the sky and completely detached from us, were aiming their bombs at the smoke line on the ground, and a gentle breeze was drifting the smoke line back over us. An indescribable kind of panic comes over you at such times. We stood tensed in muscle and frozen in intellect, watching each flight approach and pass over us, feeling trapped and completely helpless. And then all of an instant the universe became filled with a gigantic rattling, as of huge dry seeds in a mammoth dry gourd. I doubt any of us had ever heard that sound before, but instinct told us what it was. It was bombs by the hundred, hurtling down through the air above us. Many times I've heard bombs whistle or swish or rustle, but never before had I heard bombs rattle. I still don't know the explanation of it, but it is an awful sound. We dived. Some got in a dugout. Others made foxholes and ditches, and some got behind a garden wall, although which side would be behind was anybody's guess. I was too late for the dugout. The nearest place was a wagon shed, which formed one end of the stone house. The rattle was right down upon us. I remember hitting the ground flat, all spread out like the cartoons of people flattened by steamrollers, and then squirming like an eel to get under one of the heavy wagons in the shed. An officer whom I didn't know was wriggling beside me. We stopped at the same time, simultaneously feeling it was hopeless to move further. The bombs were already crashing around us. We lay with our heads slightly up, like two snakes, staring at each other. I know it was in both our minds and in our eyes, asking each other what to do. Neither of us knew. We said nothing. We just lay sprawled, gaping at each other in a futile appeal, our faces about a foot apart, until it was over. There is no description of the sound and fury of those bombs except to say it was chaos and an awaiting for darkness. The feeling of the blast was sensational. The air struck you in hundreds of continuing flutters. Your ears drummed and rang. You could feel quick little waves of concussions on your chest and in your eyes. At last, the sound died down, and we looked at each other in disbelief. Gradually, we left the foxholes and sprawling places and came out to see what the sky had in store for us. As far as we could see, other waves were approaching from behind. When a wave would pass a little to the side of us, we were garrulously grateful, for most of them flew directly overhead. Time and again, the rattle came down over us. Bombs struck in the orchard to our left. They struck orchards ahead of us. They struck as far as half a mile behind us. Everything about us was shaken, but our group came through unhurt. While Pyle emerged physically unscathed, 130 Americans were killed and several hundred more were wounded in the friendly fire incident. Pyle's experiences and compassion for the frontline troops led him to advocate for fight pay for the infantry. Congress listened and passed the Ernie Pyle bill in May of 1944, which created the policy of 50% extra combat pay, a policy that continues to be applied to American troops put into harm's way. By September of 1944, a month after the liberation of Paris, the stress was too much for Pyle. He publicly apologized to his readers, stating, "My spirit is wobbly and my mind is confused." And he said that if he heard one more shot or saw one more dead man, I would go off my nut. He later said that he had lost track of the point of the war, and that another 2 weeks of coverage would have seen him hospitalized with war neurosis. An exhausted Pyle wrote that he hoped that a rest at his home in New Mexico would restore his vigor to go war-horsing around the Pacific. He returned to America that month as a celebrity. He was awarded the Pulitzer Prize that year. Pyle's dispatches to the United States had been compiled into 5 books. His face was on the cover of Newsweek. There were stories about him in Look, Life, the Saturday Evening Post, Reader's Digest, and McCall's. He was invited to the White House by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He made a brief visit to Hollywood, where a movie starring Burgess Meredith and Robert Mitchum was in production. The movie was based on his Death of Captain Wascow column, which spoke to the randomness of death on the battlefield. This is the column named the best of the 20th century by the National Society of Newspaper Columnists. In this war, I have known a lot of officers who were loved and respected by the soldiers under them, but never have I crossed the trail of any man as beloved as Captain Henry T. Wascow of Belton, Texas. Captain Wascow was a company commander in the 36th Division. He had led his company since long before it left the States. He was very young, only in his middle 20s, but he carried in him a sincerity and gentleness that made people want to be guided by him. After my own father, he came next, a sergeant told me. He always looked after us, a soldier said. He'd go to bat for us every time. I've never known him to do anything unfair, another one said. I was at the foot of the mule trail the night they brought Captain Wascow's body down. The moon was nearly full at the time, and you could see far up the trail, and even partway across the valley below. Soldiers made shadows in the moonlight as they walked. Dead men had been coming down the mountain all evening, lashed onto the backs of mules. They came lying belly down across the wooden pack saddles, their heads hanging down on the left side of the mule, their stiffened legs sticking out awkwardly from the other side, bobbing up and down as the mule walked. The Italian mule skinners were afraid to walk beside dead men, so Americans had to lead the mules down that night. Even the Americans were reluctant to unlash and lift off the bodies at the bottom, so an officer had to do it himself and ask others to help. The first one came early in the morning. They slid him down from the mule and stood him on his feet for a moment while they got a new grip. In the half-light, he might have been merely a sick man standing there, leaning on the others. Then they laid him on the ground in the shadow of the low stone wall along the side of the road. I don't know who that first one was. You feel small in the presence of dead men and ashamed at being alive, and you don't ask silly questions. We left him there beside the road, that first one, and we all went back into the cowshed and sat on water cans or lay on the straw, waiting for the next batch of mules. Somebody said the dead soldier had been dead for 4 days, and then nobody said anything more about it. We talked soldier talk for an hour or more. The dead man lay all alone outside in the shadow of the low stone wall. Then a soldier came into the cowshed and said there were some more bodies outside. We went out into the road. 4 mules stood there in the moonlight in the road where this trail came down off the mountain. The soldiers who led them stood there waiting. "This one is Captain Wascow," one of them said quietly. 2 men unlashed his body from the mule and lifted it off and laid it in the shadow beside the lone stone wall. Other men took the other bodies off. Finally, there were 5 laying end to end in a long row alongside the road. You don't cover up dead men in the combat zone. They just lie there in the shadows until someone else comes after them. The unburdened mules moved off to their olive orchard. The men in the road seemed reluctant to leave. They stood around, and gradually, one by one, I could sense them moving close to Captain Wascow's body. Not so much to look, I think, as to say something in finality to him and to themselves. I stood close by and I could hear. One soldier came and looked down, and he said out loud, "God damn it." That's all he said, and then he walked away. Another one came. He said, "God damn it to hell anyway." He looked down for a few last moments, and then he turned and left. Another man came. I think he was an officer. It was hard to tell officers from men in the half-light, for all were bearded and grimy dirty. The man looked down into the dead captain's face, and then he spoke directly to him, as though he were alive. He said, "I'm sorry, old man." Then a soldier came and stood beside the officer, and bent over, and he too spoke to his dead captain, not in a whisper, but awfully tenderly, and he said, "I sure am sorry, sir." Then the first man squatted down, and he reached down and took the dead hand, and he sat there for a full 5 minutes, holding the dead hand in his own and looking intently into the dead face, and he never uttered a sound all the time he sat there. And finally he put the hand down, and then reached up and gently straightened the points of the captain's shirt collar, and then he sort of rearranged the tattered edges of his uniform around the wound. And then he got up and walked away down the road in the moonlight, all alone. After that, the rest of us went back into the cowshed, leaving the 5 dead men laying in a line, end to end, in the shadow of the low stone wall. We lay down on the straw in the cowshed, and pretty soon we were all asleep. While Pyle mentioned more than once that he feared he would die if he went to the Pacific, his sense of duty compelled him to cover the war against Japan. He left for the Pacific Front in January 1945 on the Cabot, a small aircraft carrier. In April, he was covering the invasion of Iwo Jima and had landed on the tiny atoll of Ieshima that U.S. troops had captured but had not completely cleared of Japanese troops. On the night of April 17th, Sergeant Harry Mommy asked Ernie if he would take a picture of him on the Stuart tank. Ernie jumped onto a nearby tank for Mommy. It wasn't the right one, but Mommy wasn't going to ask Ernie to move, so he snapped what was the last picture of Ernie alive. The photograph is now housed at the Ernie Pyle World War II Museum. On the 18th, Ernie was riding to the front in a Jeep with Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Coolidge, a commanding officer of the 305th Infantry Regiment, part of the 77th Infantry Division, with 3 other officers. A Japanese machine gun burst sent everyone leaping into a nearby ditch. A few seconds later, Ernie raised his head and asked if everyone was okay. Another burst of gunfire rang out, and Ernie was struck in the left temple and immediately killed. His premonition had come true. His celebrity and beloved status among troops and on the home front led to the announcement of his death to be made by President Harry Truman, who had just been in office for less than a week following the death of Franklin Roosevelt on April the 12th. Truman said, "No man in this war has so well told the story of the American fighting man as American fighting men wanted it told. He deserves the gratitude of all his countrymen." Ernie was killed 5 months before the September 2nd, 1945 end of World War II, following the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Folded up in the jacket he was wearing when killed was a draft of a column written about the end of the war in Europe. And so it is over. The catastrophe on one side of the world has run its course. The day that it had so long seemed would never come has come at last. I suppose our emotions here in the Pacific are the same as they were among allies all over the world. First, a shouting of the good news with such joyous surprise that you would think the shouter himself had brought it all about. And then an unspoken sense of gigantic relief, and then a hope that the collapse in Europe would hasten the end in the Pacific. It has been 7 months since I heard my last shot in the European war. Now I am as far away from it as it is possible to get on this globe. This is written on a little ship lying off the coast of the island of Okinawa, just south of Japan, on the other side of the world from Ardennes. But my heart is still in Europe, and that's why I'm writing this column. It is to the boys who were my friends for so long. My one regret of the war is that I was not with them when it ended. For the companionship of 2.5 years of death and misery is a spouse that tolerates no divorce. Such companionship finally becomes a part of one's soul, and it cannot be obliterated. True, I am with American boys in the other war not yet ended, but I am old-fashioned, and my sentiment runs to old things. To me, the European War is old, and the Pacific War is new. Last summer, I wrote that I hoped the end of the war could be a gigantic relief, but not an elation. In the joyousness of high spirits, it is so easy for us to forget the dead. Those who are gone would not wish themselves to be a millstone of gloom around our necks. But there are so many of the living who have had burned into their brains forever the unnatural sight of cold, dead men scattered over the hillsides and in the ditches along the high rows of hedge throughout the world. Dead men by mass production, in one country after another, month after month and year after year. Dead men in winter and dead men in summer. Dead men in such familiar promiscuity that they become monotonous. Dead men in such monstrous infinity that you come almost to hate them. Those are the things that you at home need not even try to understand. To you at home, they are columns of figures. Or he is a near one who went away and just didn't come back. You didn't see him lying so grotesque and pasty beside the gravel road in France. We saw him by the multiple thousands. That's the difference. We hope above all things that Japan won't make the same stubborn mistake that Germany did. You must credit Germany for her courage in adversity, but you can doubt her good common sense in fighting blindly on long after there was any doubt whatever about the outcome. At the time of his death in 1945, Pyle was the best-known American war correspondent. His syndicated column was published in 400 daily and 300 weekly newspapers nationwide. Millions of Americans read his column daily. Newspapers reported that his wife Jerry took the news of her husband's death bravely, but her health declined rapidly in the months following his death. She died from complications of influenza at Albuquerque, New Mexico on November the 23rd, 1945. Pyle was buried wearing his helmet among other battle casualties on Iwo Jima, between an infantry private and a combat engineer. In tribute to their friend, the men of the 77th Infantry Division erected a monument that still stands at the site of his death. Its inscription reads, "At this spot, the 77th Infantry Division lost a buddy, Ernie Pyle, 18 April 1945. General Eisenhower said, "The GIs in Europe, and that means all of us, have lost one of our best and most understanding friends." After the war, Pyle's remains were moved to the U.S. Military Cemetery on Okinawa. In 1949, his remains were some of the first to be interred at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu, Hawaii.